Hi everyone, welcome to the start of Unit 3. Unit 3 is our shortest unit of the semester. It's only going to cover Chapter 6, Integumentary System, which is the skin, and skeletal tissue, where we're going to learn about bone tissue. We are not going to learn anything about specific bones, as that will be covered in the lab portion of the course. So, starting with Unit 3, let's begin as we always do with our not really attendance questions. What is the function of stratified squamous epithelial tissue? And what is a multipotent stem cell? Go ahead and try to answer these, as they're going to tie into some of what we talk about today. And hopefully you've paused the video and tried to come up with the answers to these, and let's see if we got those correct. What is the function of stratified squamous epithelial tissue? Stratified squamous, so that means many layers of very flat cells. And stratified squamous is found on the surface of the epidermis. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. Stratified squamous epithelium is lots of layers of mostly dead cells. And this is for abrasion resistance and protection. It allows us to scratch our skin or bump up against something, and those outer dead cells flake away so that it doesn't harm anything underneath. Next, what is a multipotent stem cell? Stem cells, remember, are the cells that are dividing throughout our lifetime to produce other types of cells, and a multipotent stem cell is an adult stem cell that can divide to produce more than one type of cell. And we're going to see a multipotent stem cell later today. So let's go ahead and start talking about the skin, the integumentary system. So this is the first of our systems that we're going to cover this semester. We are going to cover the skin, the skeletal system. We're going to also cover nerves, the nervous system, and muscles, the muscular system. So even though when we talk about the integumentary system, we really just talk about the skin, but it's actually the skin and several appendages, so things like hair and nails and glands. So that's what this chapter is devoted to. And when we're talking about the skin or the integumentary system, we're going to be talking about dermatology. And dermatology is just the study of skin and associated structures. And as I just said, the integumentary system is more than just the skin. It's the skin and all of its associated appendages. So let's talk about the skin. The skin is an organ, and as a matter of fact, it's the largest organ in the body. We don't often think of the skin as an organ, because normally when we think of organ, we think about the things that we find inside our body, like the stomach or the spleen or whatever. But the skin is an organ, and it's the largest organ of the body. Typically, it ranges in size from 1.5 to 2 square meters. So that's pretty big. It makes up about 8% of our body mass. The skin is pretty heavy. And it ranges anywhere from 1/2 millimeter up to 6 millimeters thick. So it's going to be the thinnest in places like our eyelids or our lips. It's going to be the thickest right between the shoulder blades. Why between the shoulder blades? Well, historically, most of the time of our ancestors, humans walked kind of hunched, or even in some cases on all fours. So it was the back, right between the shoulder blades, that was most exposed. So that by having thicker skin there, it provided protection. And the skin is divided into 2 layers. The outer layer is called the epidermis, and in this picture over here, that's this part that's kind of being peeled upward. This is the epidermis. Derm, by the way, is a root word that means skin. Epi, remember, is above or on top of or on the surface of. The dermis is just deep to the epidermis, and it's quite a bit thicker. Now, usually when we talk about the skin, when we're studying the skin, we also talk about something called the hypodermis, which is all of this kind of yellowy colored area here. Now, the hypodermis is not technically a layer of the skin. It is mostly fat that's found just deep to the skin. But normally, as I said, when we're talking about the skin, we also talk about the hypodermis, so we will be studying the hypodermis in this chapter. So what are the functions of the skin? The skin actually has a lot of functions. First, it's going to provide resistance to things like trauma, like if you bump yourself, if you fall, if you're hit, and also to infection, if you cut yourself. There's a lot of stuff built into our skin that makes sure that any bacteria or other things that could potentially harm us are fought off before it gets into the rest of our body and spreads. So how does it do that? Well, mostly the skin is made of this protein called keratin. And keratin is what gives our skin its waterproof ability. It's what gives us that kind of tough, waxy feel. That's keratin. Next, there's going to be something called dermcidin and other things called defensins. These are all just enzymes or proteins that are going to help keep things from growing on or in our skin. Our skin is coated in this dermcidin and defensins to make it inhospitable for things to want to grow on us. We also have something called an acid mantle. Our skin has a slightly low pH. It's a little bit acidic. But also inside of our mouths, inside the anus, inside the vagina, inside the nose, all of those areas are exposed to the environment, and they're all going to have a very low pH to, again, make it inhospitable for things to grow there. The skin also serves other barrier functions. Again, our skin is water resistant, and that goes back to the keratin. Keratin allows our skin to be water resistant. That's very important because otherwise, every time we got wet, water would seep into our body, and all of our body fluids would quickly become very, very unconcentrated, very, very dilute. Now, some substances can cross. Even though the skin kind of acts as a physical barrier, it prevents things from crossing. Some things can cross. And what kind of things can cross? Well, things that are lipid-based or fat-based can cross pretty easily. For example, a lot of medications are transdermal. So, for example, a nicotine patch. Most people have seen a nicotine patch, but some other medicines also can be just applied as a patch to the skin. And if they are transdermal, if they can be applied to the skin and have an effect, they're going to be lipid-based because lipid-based substances can cross the skin. Now, one thing that I like to point out here that a lot of people don't think about, especially if they're smokers, nicotine patches work because nicotine can cross the skin. And if you are a smoker, even if you wash your hands and you wash your clothes regularly, you're still going to have quite a bit of nicotine trapped in stuff on your skin. And tar is going to be on your skin. Even if you wash your hands right after you smoke, you're still going to have nicotine and tar on your skin and on your clothes. So if you have children, well, children have very, very thin skin, and it's not as developed as adult skin. So if you are a smoker, every time you hold your child, you are effectively giving them a nicotine patch. That nicotine that's on your hands, on your clothing, on your skin, when you touch your child, that nicotine is going to transfer to them and is going to very easily cross their skin. Even if you don't smoke around your child is effectively getting nicotine patches every time you touch them. So I always caution students who smoke to be very, very careful if they have kids, because they do things that they're not aware that they're doing most of the time by transferring that nicotine to a child. The skin is also an ultraviolet radiation barrier, a UV barrier. So we are constantly being bombarded by ultraviolet radiation from the sun. And most of that ultraviolet radiation, when it hits our skin, it can cause damage. But our skin has several mechanisms, things like DNA, things like melanin, those kind of things will actually block or absorb ultraviolet radiation so that it doesn't do as much harm as it could. Vitamin D synthesis. Vitamin D is the only vitamin that our body can actually synthesize or make. Every other vitamin that we have comes from our diet. We are unable to make vitamins except for vitamin D. And vitamin D is another reason why we need cholesterol. Remember, we talked a few times now how cholesterol gets a bad rap, although we tend to think about all of the harmful things that it does. We saw back in chapter 3 that it's very important for cells. We saw in chapter 2 that it's very important for steroid hormones. It's also very important for vitamin D. Vitamin D comes from cholesterol. That cholesterol is moved up to the surface of our skin. And when ultraviolet radiation from the sun hits our skin, it converts that cholesterol into an inactive form of vitamin D. That inactive vitamin D then travels to either our liver or more often to our kidneys. And the liver and kidneys will then convert that to active vitamin D. And vitamin D is very important for calcium levels in our body, as we will see in the next chapter. When we get to bones, we're going to see vitamin D plays a huge role in the levels of calcium in our body. The skin also has a function of sensation. We have several different types of nerve endings in our skin, things like heat detector, things like cold detectors, things like touch receptors. Several different types of sensations arise from our skin. Now, our skin does not typically detect something inside of our body. It detects something that arose outside of our body. And the name for receptors or nerve endings that detect something that arose from outside of our body, those are called exteroceptors. Exteroceptors detect things that arise from outside of our body. When you go outside and it's hot, your skin can feel that, but that heat is arising from outside of our body. If you touch a hot stove, that's something that arose from outside of your body. Thermoregulation. As we saw way back in chapter 1 when we were talking about feedback loops, the skin plays a role in regulating our body heat. And it can do that by working with those exteroceptors to detect if it is hot or cold. But our skin actually has a lot of blood vessels in it. Most of them are really, really small capillaries. And we have something called cutaneous, which means related to the skin, cutaneous vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Those are some big words, so let's unpack what they mean. Vaso means blood vessel. Constriction is when a blood vessel gets smaller. Vasoconstriction is when a blood vessel is getting smaller so that less blood gets through it. Dilation, it's getting bigger. So vasodilation, the blood vessel is getting larger so that more blood can flow through it. Well, if these blood vessels are very close to the surface of our skin, when it's really warm and we're sweating, Remember, the sweat, as it evaporates, it cools the skin. So if we let more blood into the surface of the skin, if we have vasodilation, then as that sweat evaporates, it's going to cool the skin, and in turn, it's going to cool the blood. When you go outside and it's really, really cold, you don't want that blood to get cooled off, which would then cool off the rest of your body much faster. So we'll get vasoconstriction, and less blood will flow into the surface of the skin, preventing us from cooling down too much. Nonverbal communication. So that just means communicating without the use of words. And that's part of what we see up here in this picture. The skin, especially the skin in the face, is very tightly tied to some muscles underneath it. And facial expressions can really convey a lot of information. So we can see here, just based on facial movement there, that we can get an idea of what this person might be feeling. They look a little bit upset, a little bit distraught about something, or possibly they're in deep thought. And here, one of our closest relatives, we can see very similar stuff. It looks like he is in very deep thought, or kind of transfixed by something. So nonverbal communication. So now let's switch gears and let's start talking about the makeup of the skin, and beginning with the outermost part, the epidermis. Let's talk about the epidermis. The epidermis is keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Remember when we looked at stratified squamous epithelium in the tissue chapter, there was keratinized and non-keratinized. And the skin is keratinized. It has a lot of keratin in it, as we mentioned just moments ago. And it's many layers thick, stratified squamous, which is what we see right here. But there are some various types of cells. Most of them, by far most of them, are cells called keratinocytes. Cyte at the end of a word just means cell. So really this is a keratin cell, or a cell that makes keratin. Most of these cells are keratinocytes. We also have a layer of stem cells. The very bottommost layer of the epidermis, we'll see in just a moment, is something called the stratum basale. We'll see that in just a moment. But this is a layer of stem cells, and it's constantly in mitosis. It's constantly dividing to make all of these other types of cells that we find in the epidermis. Remember, they are multipotent, so they can make keratinocytes, but they also make these other types of cells that we find here. Next, we have something called a melanocyte. A melanocyte is this kind of dark brown area right here. Melanocytes are cells that make something called melanin. Melanin is a pigment that blocks or absorbs ultraviolet radiation. It's also what gives our skin most of its color. In the next lecture, we're going to see exactly how melanin works to give our skin its color and how it works to protect us from ultraviolet radiation. We have tactile cells, formerly called Merkel cells. That's this little guy right here that looks like a blue starfish. Tactile cells, or Merkel cells. Now, tactile cells, they are going to be kind of sitting right on top of a nerve ending. This little yellow guy right there. The nerve ending does not extend up into the epidermis. It stays in the dermis. And the tactile cell sits right on the very bottom of the epidermis, right there where the stratum basale is. And this tactile cell, the Merkel cell, conveys information about touch to this nerve ending that it's related to, the one that it's sitting right on top of. So when we touch something, We stimulate these tactile cells, and they convey information to this nerve ending, hey, we are touching something. And then that nerve is going to send signals to our central nervous system, eventually to our brain, and it's going to convey that information that the brain interprets as, oh, we're touching something. And finally, we have dendritic cells, formerly called Langerhans cells. That's this big branching green guy right here. Dendritic cells are kind of like the neighborhood watch of your epidermis. They're reaching out in between, they're very extensive, they spread all through in between these keratinocytes. And what they're doing is they are looking for things that do not belong in your epidermis. Things like bacteria or viruses, things like certain chemicals, things like dead cells, all sorts of stuff that should not be present in this part of the epidermis. And when it detects that, it releases some chemicals that call your immune system to the area. The dendritic cell itself doesn't do a whole lot. It can, in some cases, phagocytize, but for the most part, it just sounds the alarm so the rest of your immune system can come and do the work. Now let's look at the structure of the epidermis as far as layers. Those cells that we just saw are mostly going to be found in one or two layers of the epidermis, but the epidermis has several layers. So let's start at the deepest point, the very lowest point. We're going to start with something called the stratum basale. And the stratum basale I mentioned just a moment ago is where we find those stem cells. And it is in constant mitosis. It's constantly producing more cells. So when it divides, just like every stem cell, it's going to divide and produce two cells. One of them is going to remain a stem cell. The other is going to become probably a keratinocyte, possibly one of those other cells that we just mentioned. And it's going to keep dividing and dividing and dividing and making more and more and more keratinocytes, which is what I'm going to talk about. So they are pushed up into the next layer. It's kind of being pushed from the bottom upward. And those new cells that we just made move up into the next layer called the stratum spinosum. Now the stratum basale was only one layer thick, but the stratum spinosum has a lot of layers. And the stratum spinosum, these cells are actively making keratin. These are where those keratinocytes are pumping keratin out, just constantly making more and more and more keratin. Now, meanwhile, that stratum basale is still going through mitosis. It's still pushing cells upward, which means cells that were made earlier, the cells in the stratum spinosum, they're going to be pushed upward even further. Eventually, they're pushed into the stratum granulosum. Now, the stratum granulosum, we're starting to get pretty far away from down here at the stratum basale. Let's look at something that we might not have mentioned yet. We kind of talked about it back in chapter 5 when we talked about tissues. Remember epidermis, even epithelium, stratified squamous epithelium, it's not going to be innervated. Well, stratified squamous isn't going to be innervated. It's also not going to have blood flow. There are no blood vessels in stratified squamous epithelium. Now we can see blood vessels here, but we can also see that they're all stopping before they extend into the epidermis. The epidermis itself is not innervated, and it is avascular. That's very important. It's not innervated, and it is avascular. So as we are pushing these cells from the stratum spinosum up into the stratum granulosum, we're getting pretty far away from this blood flow down here. nutrients, oxygen, stuff like that cannot be passed through so many layers of these keratinocytes. So by the time we get to the stratum granulosum, those keratinocytes begin to die off. In the stratum granulosum, the keratinocytes are dying off. So they're going to start to lose their contents. And basically they are left as little sacs of keratin. Now, meanwhile, the stratum basale is still dividing. It's still pushing cells up into the stratum spinosum. It's still pushing cells from the stratum spinosum up into the stratum granulosum. The stratum granulosum is then going to be pushed up into the stratum corneum. Now, the stratum corneum is so far away from the stratum basale that we're not getting any of that nutrient-rich stuff being passed out through the blood. We're not getting any oxygen being passed out through the blood. So these cells in the stratum corneum are completely dead. They are completely dead. And up at the top, this is the part that's exposed. When you touch your skin, you're touching the top of the stratum corneum. And the slightest touch is going to brush away those cells at the top of the stratum corneum. When you scratch yourself, you're going to scratch away lots of cells. When you bump up against something, you're knocking off lots of those cells. But that's completely okay, because the stratum basale is down here continually making more cells. So it's kind of like an escalator, starting at the bottom and just pushing everything upward. By the time it gets to the top, it's dead and it's flaking away, but it's being replaced down here with brand new live cells. So how do you remember what the order of those is? Well, come get some bacon. Everyone remembers bacon. So this is the order of those layers from the most superficial, the stratum corneum, to the most deep, the stratum basale. Come, corneum, get, granulosum, some, spinosum, bacon, basale. But now, if we look back here, we can see there's this other layer, the stratum lucidum, that we didn't talk about. And the stratum lucidum is really, really thin, and it's clear, and in most places in the body, we don't see it. Either because it's absent or because it's so thin and clear that it doesn't really do much, and we don't see it in microscope images. Except for palms of the hand and soles of the feet. In the palms of the hand and the soles of the feet, the stratum lucidum is really thick, and it can be seen between the stratum corneum and the stratum granulosum. But for the most part, we can just ignore the stratum lucidum. We go stratum corneum, granulosum, spinosum, and basale. Come get some bacon. So since we are basically pushing more and more and more cells up from the deep parts, as we get to the superficial, it's flaking away. How much is actually flaking away? It's kind of spooky how much is shedding. We lose from our epidermis about 50,000 cells every minute, which adds up over our lifetime to about 40 pounds of skin. 40 pounds of those dead cells are lost in our lifetime. But that's okay, because we've got these little critters that live on our bodies, that also live in our beds, and they're constantly munching away on those dead cells. So they're not most of the time they're not just building up. They're getting eaten by these little critters that live on us. Sleep tight. I'm going to tell you something interesting. Over the course of your mattress's lifetime, from the time you buy your mattress to the time you get rid of your mattress, it gains about 10 pounds. Where do those 10 pounds come from? You guessed it. It's all of that skin that you're shedding. So it's a combination of that skin plus these little critters eating it, and having their droppings build up in your mattress is full of all kinds of good stuff. So tonight when you lay down, sleep tight. Moving down a little deeper now into the dermis. The dermis is mostly connective tissue, so it's not like the epithelial tissue that we saw in the epidermis. It's connective tissue. And it's about 0.2 up to 4 millimeters thick. It ranges. We have a few different types of cells that we find here. We find things called fibroblasts. When you see blast at the end of a word, remember that means to make or to build. Fibroblasts are making the fibers, like the collagen that we find here. We find macrophages, big cells that do phagocytosis. These are part of our immune system. They're wandering through, and if they find something that doesn't belong there, they will eat it. They will phagocytize it. We find mast cells, which are very similar to the dendritic cells that we saw a moment ago. Mast cells are also part of like the neighborhood watch. They're looking for things that are out of place, and they release a chemical alarm signal to call in your immune system if something does show up that shouldn't be there. And leukocytes. Leukocytes are white blood cells. These are the cells in our blood that make up our immune system. So the skin really has a lot of cells and a lot of proteins, a lot of enzymes, all kinds of stuff there, kind of making sure nothing gets through. Because that really is the primary way that something could get into our body, is straight through our skin. Our skin is there watching to prevent that from happening. Now the dermis is broken down into layers just like the epidermis was, but there's only 2 layers in the dermis. There's the most superficial layer called the papillary layer. And the papillary layer is in these weird little up and down folds called dermal papillae. So that's where it got its name. So the papillary layer is superficial to the other part of the dermis called the reticular layer. The papillary layer is more superficial, the reticular layer is more deep. And the papillary layer is mostly going to be collagen and elastic fibers. It's pretty thin. It only makes up about 20% of the thickness of the dermis. And as I said, it's got these weird folded areas called dermal papillae. Papil, P-A-P-I-L, is a root word that means nipple, and that's just because the raised area kind of resembles a nipple. The dermal papillae are very highly vascularized. Remember, the epidermis was avascular. But just deep to the epidermis, where we find these dermal papillae, that's where all those blood vessels were. Lots of them. So that means if you ever get a paper cut and you start to bleed, you know you cut all the way through the epidermis and you at least reached the dermal papillae, the papillary layer. If you get a paper cut and you don't bleed, then you only cut through some of these layers of the epidermis, and you did not reach the dermal papillae. There are these structures called Meissner's corpuscles, and they are found throughout the dermis, but they are very, very concentrated in these dermal papillae. Meissner's corpuscles detect very light touch. So if you ever just barely touch your skin and you can feel it, most of that is coming from Meissner's corpuscles. Then we have these areas in between the dermal papillae where it's kind of sunken. These are called epidermal ridges. Epidermal ridges are the sunken in part between the dermal papillae, which are the raised part. Now, in some places, like on our fingertips and on our toes, they're raised, and the dermal papillae are really raised, and the ridges are really, really sunken. These produce something called friction ridges. Friction ridges are really what we typically call fingerprints. Now, fingerprints or friction ridges primarily are there to allow grip. If our fingers were completely smooth, it would be a lot harder to grip things. But where we have these raised and sunken areas, it allows for better grip. And the pattern seems to be genetic. Now, unless you have an identical twin, no one else on the planet has the same pattern of fingerprints as you. But they are genetic in that people that you are closely related to will have similar fingerprints. So the closer you are related to someone, the more similar your fingerprints are, but they will not be the exact same unless you have an identical twin. Going deeper still, the deeper portion of the dermis is called the reticular layer. And the reticular layer makes up about 80% of the thickness of your dermis. So it's much thicker than the papillary layer was. Now, it's mostly dense, irregular connective tissue, but it's got pockets of adipose tissue extending up into it from the hypodermis. But the reticular layer is mostly dense, irregular connective tissue. And remember from the tissue chapter, dense, irregular is lots of collagen packed very tightly but running all different directions, and that allows it to withstand tension from multiple different directions. That's why we can kind of pinch our skin and move it around, and it's completely fine. Now, even though these collagen fibers are running all different directions, there will be bundles of them that run in the same direction. These are called cleavage lines, and that's what we see over here. For example, in the shoulders, the cleavage lines kind of run at an angle like this towards your chest. Across your chest, lower chest, upper abdomen, they run kind of parallel to each other, left to right. Down here in your lower abdomen, again, they run kind of at an angle. So that's what these red lines are. They're showing the direction of the cleavage lines. Now, these are going to be very important for anyone going into a surgical field, because normally when there's going to be some sort of surgery, the doctor will try to make the incisions parallel. Most people who have an appendectomy scar, it's going to be kind of running at an angle. It's not going to be going straight across. And that's just because, one, it makes for less scarring, and two, it allows for the healing to happen a little bit faster. The healing will happen a little bit faster because if you cut against the grain, it will kind of pucker with every movement. But if you cut with the grain, then it allows the healing to happen much quicker. Now, that's not always the case, because really, any woman that has ever had a C-section, chances are it's going straight left to right across your lower abdomen, and that's not following the cleavage lines. So it's not always the case, but most of the time, surgical incisions run parallel to the cleavage lines. And then similar, we also have something called flexure lines, which we see over here. Flexure lines are going to be found in places where there's repeated bending. And here, the dermis and the epidermis are going to be held very, very tightly to the bones or muscles that are deep to them. And that just keeps the skin from bunching up anywhere where there's a lot of flexing, such as the knuckles of your fingers, the palms of your hands, places like that. And finally, let's talk about the hypodermis. The hypodermis, again, not a true layer of the skin. It's down here deep to the epidermis and the dermis both. It's primarily adipose tissue, so yellow fat. And it's going to be an important site for hypodermic injections. If you ever get a hypodermic shot, they are injecting into your hypodermis. And your hypodermis primarily is going to make up something called your subcutaneous fat. Just deep to your skin, there is a pretty thick layer of fat. In different areas, it's going to be a little bit thicker, and in different people, it's going to be a little bit thicker. So, for example, the abdomen, the thighs, breasts of a female, buttocks, those areas tend to have a pretty thick subcutaneous fat layer. Now, this is an energy reservoir. We store energy as fat, and that fat many times is going to be held just beneath the skin as subcutaneous fat. It also serves as thermoregulation. Fat is a really good insulator, so it helps maintain our body temperature. Impact resistance. Well, as I just said, there is a pretty good layer of subcutaneous fat on the buttocks. It's common if you fall, you're going to land on your butt. So this helps with impact resistance. Even if you fall on your arm, there's a layer of subcutaneous fat on your arm. It may be thin, but it's there and it will help with impact resistance. Now the scalp, for example, has practically no subcutaneous fat. There is some there, but it is very, very thin. It tends to be much thicker in the abdomen, the hips, the thighs, breasts of a female, buttocks. And in females, the subcutaneous fat on average is about 8% thicker than in males. Now, regardless of male or female, infants, that's a misspelling, infants and the elderly will have very low subcutaneous fat levels. And this is also why infants and the elderly have a lot more of a problem with thermoregulation. They get really cold or really hot very easily because they don't have this layer of subcutaneous fat. All right, so that's going to be where we end this lecture. We're going to have one more lecture on the integumentary system where we look more at the functions and at things that can go wrong. So watch for that second lecture coming up and let me know if you have any questions. Take care and I'll talk to you next time.